Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Tonight's story begins in a quiet corner of history, where the sands settle slowly. The air feels heavy with ancient warmth, and time seems in no particular hurry. If you listen closely, you might imagine the gentle shuffle of priests preparing morning offerings, or the faint whisper of incense drifting through stone corridors. It's the sort of place where everything moves at an unbothered pace, and even the gods themselves seem content to let the hours float by like dust in a sunbeam. In this first part of our long, sleepy journey, we'll drift into the world of ancient Egyptian gods. Not the dramatic versions you see in modern movies with glowing eyes and explosions, but the quieter, older versions that lived mostly in the minds of farmers, scribes, boatmen, and temple keepers. The version of the gods that moved with the slowness of the Nile at dawn. The version that didn't need to shout to be noticed. They simply existed with calm authority, as much a part of daily life as bread, water, and the hope that tomorrow's flood would be generous, but not too generous so. Let's take a slow breath. Imagine the warm desert night settling around us, and step into this landscape together. Egyptian mythology begins, fittingly, in a world of stillness. Before anything existed, the Egyptians imagined a great expanse of dark, silent water called Nun. It wasn't dramatic water. No violent waves, no storms, no sea monsters threatening to leap out. Just a quiet, infinite lake with nothing in it except potential. Out of this calm water rose the first god, Atum. He didn't burst out gloriously. He simply arrived. The way a thought arrives exactly when you need it, even if you weren't expecting it. Atum was considered the creator, but again, not in a hurried or noisy way. Creation unfolded softly. Atum brought forth Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. Shu represented the breath between one moment and the next, while Tefnut held the gentle dampness that kept the world from cracking apart. The Egyptians liked balance, and it shows. Even their earliest gods worked in pairs, quietly keeping the universe steady. Shu and Tefnut then produced Geb and Nut. Geb was the earth, patient and grounded. Nut was the sky, stretching endlessly overhead. In temples and tomb art, you often see Nut's long, curved body arching protectively over Geb, covered in tiny stars like freckles. She looks peaceful, even though she's holding up the entire heavens. Meanwhile, Geb lies beneath her, not complaining, which is impressive considering his job is to literally support the world's weight. Together, they formed the stage where everything else would happen. Even their daily separation was considered a gentle ritual. Shu stood between them, keeping sky and earth apart so that life could exist in between. Without him, Nut would collapse onto Geb, and everything would end. But Shu never seemed stressed about the responsibility. He just kept standing there, as dependable as the dry breeze across a field. From Geb and Nut came the gods who would become the most famous, Osiris, Isis, Seth, and Nephthys. In later parts, we'll drift deeper into their stories. But for now, imagine them as young forces shaping the world with slow, steady influence. Osiris was order and fertility. Isis was magic and protection. Seth was chaos and storms. Nephthys was night and transitions. A balanced family, even if one member you know who occasionally made things interesting. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Staying in the slower lane of history, the Egyptians didn't just think of gods as distant cosmic beings. To them, the gods were everywhere, and everything had a divine presence. Every rock, every breeze, every strange cat that stared at you while judging your life choices. If something existed, it probably had a god somewhere in its lineage. One of the most respected gods was Ra, the sun god who traveled across the sky each day in a boat. The Egyptians imagined him moving steadily, never rushing, never falling behind schedule. They saw his journey as a kind of cosmic commute. Every morning he rose in the east, gently illuminating the world. Throughout the day, he glided across the sky at a measured pace. At night, he traveled through the underworld, including the darker, more confusing sections that we'll explain in later parts. Ra's job never ended, but he never seemed flustered about it. A true professional, if Ra represented light and time, then another important figure, Thoth, represented knowledge. Thoth wasn't a loud or showy god. He was the equivalent of the quiet person who always knows the answer but never interrupts. With the head of an ibis and a calm expression, he took notes on the universe, making sure that time, laws, and spells were recorded properly. Scribes especially loved Thoth. They imagined him guiding their hands as they copied scrolls hour after hour. A very peaceful partnership, except when the ink dried out too quickly. But Thoth probably forgave them for complaining. Next comes one of the most recognizable goddesses, Hathor. She was associated with joy, beauty, music, and motherhood, but not the wild kind of joy. More like the comforting happiness you feel when someone hands you warm bread after a long day. Hathor's temples often included columns carved with her serene face, as if she were watching over visitors with gentle patience. Many Egyptians believed she helped guide souls into the afterlife, welcoming them with a nurturing presence. Considering how stressful death could be, it was nice to imagine that the first person greeting you would be a goddess known for being kind. But if Hathor represented warm affection, then Sekhmet represented something much more intense. Sekhmet was a lioness goddess associated with power and protection. Her glare alone could probably make enemies reconsider their life choices. Yet despite her fierce reputation, Egyptians also believed she could bring healing. It's that dual nature again. Even the strong, fiery goddess had a quiet, restorative side. Still, in daily life, most people probably preferred Hathor's vibe. Another important deity was Ptah, the craftsman god of Memphis. Ptah was believed to create through thought alone. He didn't need thunder, lightning, or dramatic speeches. He imagined the world, and the world appeared. It's an impressively low-effort technique. One many people today would probably appreciate if they could choose it for cleaning their houses. Ptah's worshippers included sculptors, builders, and artisans. They trusted him to give stability to their tools and inspiration to their hands. A calm, dependable god for a calm, methodical profession. As civilization grew, so did the pantheon. Local gods merged with major ones. For example, when Thebes became more important politically, its local god Amun began to rise in prominence too. Eventually he fused with Ra, becoming Amun-Ra. This was the Egyptian version of combining two powerful brands. Amun brought hidden strength. Ra brought cosmic authority. Together they formed a sort of quiet, universal presence that everyone respected, even if they didn't see him every day. Priests played a large role in maintaining these beliefs. But, contrary to modern expectations, Priests didn't always look mystical or dramatic. Many of them shaved their heads, wore simple linen garments, and spent most of their time cleaning and maintaining temple spaces. Temples represented the homes of gods, so priests were essentially caretakers. They woke up early, washed statues, replaced offerings, trimmed wicks, and swept floors. A surprisingly domestic job, though performed with deep respect. Temples themselves were built to feel timeless. Tall walls blocked outside noise. Courtyards stayed cool even in the harsh sun. Long hallways painted with hieroglyphs felt quiet and still, like they were holding their breath. Soft chanting echoed through chambers at certain times, and incense rose slowly toward painted ceilings. Anyone entering would have felt a calm weight settle around them, a reminder that this was a place where the divine lingered. Common people didn't enter inner temple sanctuaries, but they still interacted with gods in their own ways. Many kept small household shrines. Others wore amulets shaped like gods or protective symbols. Some left offerings at local shrines or talked to statues as if speaking to old friends. Religion wasn't separate from life. It was woven into daily routines. Even the simple act of pouring water on the ground for ancestors was a quiet spiritual gesture. Animals, too, played sacred roles. Cats symbolized protection, especially associated with Bastet, the cat goddess. Cats were so respected that harming one was a serious offense. This explains why ancient Egyptian homes likely had the calmest rodent-free nights in history. Bulls represented strength and fertility, often connected to the Apis bull, which lived in Memphis under careful priestly observation. Falcons symbolized sky power through Horus, another major deity. Crocodiles represented the god Sobek, who mixed danger with creation. Not the most comforting combination, but Egyptians appreciated balance. Daily life was slow and stable. Farmers planted and harvested according to the Nile's rhythm. Craftsmen worked in long, steady motions. Fishermen cast nets with habitual ease. Even markets, busy as they were, had a predictable atmosphere. People traded bread, linen, pottery, fish, beer, and tiny bronze figurines of gods. Nothing rushed. Nothing felt out of place. And through all of this, the gods quietly shaped perception. People believed they influenced agriculture, childbirth, weather, illness, dreams, and even how well a boat sailed upstream. But unlike the thunderous gods of other cultures, Egyptian deities usually acted in subtle ways. A healthy child, a gentle flood, or a well-timed breeze could be interpreted as divine approval. A failed harvest or sudden fever might be a sign that a protective charm was needed. Everything was part of the same slow-moving, spiritual network. The most important transition in Egyptian thought was the idea that gods weren't fixed. A god could shift forms depending on the place or need. Amen could be hidden or radiant. Hathor could be motherly or distant. Ra could be youthful at dawn and old at sunset. This fluidity helped Egyptians understand the world's complexity without forcing everything into rigid categories. Their gods were adaptable, like the river that shaped their land. As we continue through these parts, we'll explore more of these deities. We'll look at the stories, the rituals, the temples, and the beliefs surrounding them. But for now, we stay in this gentle introduction. A landscape of golden sand, quiet temples, and gods who walk softly through the imagination. In Egyptian belief, life and death were not opposites. They were connected stages, like the two banks of the Nile. The gods guided people through both. They were guardians of daylight and caretakers of the afterlife. They stood in the background of every moment, not demanding attention, but always present. With that thought, we'll rest here, in the calm silence of early creation, among gods who whisper rather than shout, surrounded by a civilization that found comfort in order, rhythm, and the steady passage of time. Let's move gently into the next part of this long, quiet journey. We return to the desert landscape where the air feels slow and warm, and the gods of Egypt remain exactly where we left them, waiting patiently like statues that have been watching the horizon for thousands of years. Nothing has changed too quickly, as usual. The ancient world preferred a steady pace, and will follow that same rhythm. We ended part 1 with the image of Egyptian life flowing like the Nile itself, calm, cyclical, predictable. Now we drift a little deeper into that flow and turn our attention toward the next layer of myth and daily practice. You might think of this section as a gentle walk through a long temple corridor, where every step echoes softly and every carved symbol has something to say, even if it says it very slowly. Taught to begin. Let's settle our thoughts on Osiris, one of the most important gods in the Egyptian imagination. Osiris symbolized rebirth, order, and the quiet certainty that life would continue even after death. When Egyptians thought of Osiris, they didn't picture chaos or drama. They pictured green skin symbolizing growth, a white crown of Upper Egypt, and a calm, composed figure wrapped in mummy-like cloth. Even his posture looked restful, as if he knew he didn't need to move much to make things happen. Osiris ruled the afterlife, but he did it with a calm authority that reassured people rather than frightened them. Osiris became the guide for souls, the one who helped them navigate the slow and serious journey from earthly life to eternal existence. But the Egyptians didn't imagine the afterlife as a frightening place. It was more like an extended version of life along the Nile, but with fewer taxes and hopefully better weather. A soul that lived truthfully would continue living peacefully under Osiris's gentle rule. One that didn't, well, let's just say the Egyptians tried their best to avoid that outcome, and we'll drift into those details shortly. Where Osiris brings stillness, Isis brings movement, but a slow and purposeful kind. Isis was the goddess of magic, motherhood, healing, and protection. People saw her as a constant, watchful presence that followed them through life. Mothers, workers, travelers, and even rulers prayed to her. She was believed to have powerful magic, but the Egyptians didn't imagine her waving a wand dramatically. Her magic felt more like soft, persistent energy, like water smoothing stone over centuries. Her devotion to Osiris was legendary. In the myths, she searched endlessly for him after he was harmed, putting his body back together with quiet determination. The Egyptians admired this. It reflected a value they held deeply, patience, even in the face of difficulty. They used Isis as an example of how to move steadily through hardship. She wasn't the type to panic. She did what needed to be done, and she did it with a steady heart. Seth, the brother who brought disorder, often gets painted as the villain. But the Egyptians didn't really see Seth as evil. He was necessary. He represented the unpredictable forces of the world, storms, chaos, deserts, and conflict. Without Seth, the balance between order and disorder would collapse. Egyptians were quite practical about this. They understood that life included sandstorms and scorpions, just like it included sunlight and lotus flowers. Seth simply embodied the forces that made people uncomfortable. His temples show that he was respected, even if everyone kept an eye on him, just to be safe. Nephthys completes the group. She was associated with night, morning, and transitions. A quieter goddess, often depicted standing behind important scenes in myth, offering calm support. Egyptians believed she stood at the threshold between worlds, guiding souls during delicate moments. She wasn't as famous as Isis, but she played an essential role that people trusted. Together, these four deities represented a natural cycle: life, protection, disorder, and the ability to move between states. The Egyptians didn't carve these ideas into long philosophical texts. They showed them through rituals, stories, and temple images. Even farmers who couldn't read understood the balance these gods created, because they saw that same balance in the world around them every day. Now, let's drift more deeply into the underworld, what the Egyptians called the Duat, a realm ruled by Osiris and traveled through by Ra each night. This wasn't a fiery underworld or a dark pit of torment. It was a landscape full of slow-moving waters, fields, gates, and guardians. The Duat felt more like a complicated nighttime journey, the sort where you occasionally check your map just to make sure you're still heading in the right direction. When a person died, the Egyptians believed their soul had to pass through the Duat to reach the afterlife. The soul would stand before a tribunal of gods, but none was more important than the moment when the heart was weighed. The heart, considered the center of thought and emotion, was placed on a scale against the feather of Mat, the goddess of truth and cosmic order. The idea wasn't dramatic judgment. It was more like a calm assessment of whether a person lived in harmony with the world. If the heart was lighter or equal to the feather, the soul passed peacefully. If it wasn't, well, the Egyptians preferred not to dwell on that. You generally don't spend too much time thinking about giant soul-eating creatures right before bed. Mat herself wasn't a goddess of flashy miracles. She represented a quiet principle, everything in balance. The Egyptians believed society worked when people lived according to Mat. Speaking truth, respecting elders, honoring the gods, and doing your job without too much fuss were all part of that balance. Many Egyptians probably saw Mat as the ideal state of daily life. Not exciting, but steady. A world that made sense. Now, drifting back to the living world, let's revisit the temples where these beliefs took physical form. Egyptian temples were designed to feel like the creation of the universe. Each chamber symbolized a different stage of cosmic emergence. The outer courtyards represented the world of humans, bright and open. Moving inward, the halls became darker and quieter, like the earliest, unformed waters of Nun. By the time you reached the sanctuary, the heart of the temple, the space felt still and sacred. Only priests entered these inner rooms, performing rituals on behalf of the community. Priests woke before dawn, bathed, shaved, and dressed in clean linen. Cleanliness was not optional. The gods were believed to appreciate order, and priests took that responsibility very seriously. They opened the sanctuary, removed yesterday's offerings, washed the statue of the god, wrapped it in fresh cloth, applied oils, and presented new food. This wasn't worship the way many people imagine it today. It was more like caring for an honored family member. The god didn't physically eat the food, of course. Priests knew this, but they believed the divine presence consumed the essence, leaving the physical food untouched. Afterward, the priests ate the offerings themselves, which was a pretty efficient system, all things considered. Every temple also had sacred animals. In some places, a living bull represented a powerful god. In others, cats, crocodiles, ibises, or falcons were cared for with great respect. When these animals died, They were mummified and buried with ceremony. People bought small animal mummies as offerings, which explains why modern museums have so many cat, bird, and crocodile mummies. Egyptians truly believed these creatures carried divine energy. They didn't see animals as pets or decorations. They saw them as symbols of qualities that humans admired. A falcon's keen sight, a cat's grace, a bull's strength, a crocodile's ability to survive in harsh conditions. Each creature reflected something powerful and meaningful in the natural world. Now let's glide gently into the daily life of ordinary Egyptians, because their relationship with the gods wasn't limited to festivals or temple rituals. Daily life was filled with small spiritual actions. Someone going on a journey might pour water on the ground to honor their ancestors. A mother might tie a protective amulet around her child's neck. A worker carving stone might whisper a small prayer to Ptah for steady hands. Nothing loud or dramatic, just quiet. Interactions woven into everyday life. Homes had small shrines with clay figures or painted symbols. Simple things, not elaborate. People didn't need grand statues to feel the presence of a god. A small carving or a painted eye of Horus could offer comfort. Many families especially liked Base, a small dwarf-shaped god who protected households, especially during childbirth. He wasn't graceful, and he certainly didn't follow the usual idealized proportions seen in Egyptian art. But Egyptians adored him. Base reminded them that protection didn't always come from the tallest or most impressive figure. Sometimes it came from a friend who stood by your side, making funny faces at the things that scared you. Speaking of household gods, Thoth, the hippopotamus goddess, was another favorite. She protected mothers and children, and her shape part hippo, part woman, part crocodile might look unusual to modern eyes. But Egyptians found her reassuring. Hippos may have been dangerous, but they were also fierce protectors of their young. Thoth carried that energy into the home. In public life, the gods were celebrated through festivals. Some were small and local. Others were huge, drawing crowds from multiple towns. One famous festival was the beautiful Feast of the Valley. People crossed the Nile to visit the West Bank, bringing food, drink, and music to honor ancestors and the god Amen. The atmosphere wasn't somber. It was more like a peaceful family gathering. People ate, talked, and remembered their loved ones. The line between worship and daily life blurred. Another major festival honored Hathor. Her celebrations involved music, dancing, and drinking, but not the rowdy kind you might expect. The Egyptians believed joy itself was sacred. They felt that making the goddess happy created harmony in the world. And so they played instruments, clapped rhythmically, and sipped beer sweetened with dates. A very gentle party by modern standards, though some participants probably woke up the next morning wishing Hathor offered a hangover cure. Now let's shift gently to monarchy, because Egyptian kings played a central role in connecting humans with gods. Pharaohs weren't considered gods in the sense that they walked around with lightning powers. They were seen as divine intermediaries who maintained math. Their job was to ensure that the temples were supplied, rituals performed, borders protected, and the Nile's cycle respected. A pharaoh who did all this successfully was considered a good ruler. One who didn't, well, the gods would handle it, eventually. Kings associated themselves strongly with Horus, the falcon god of kingship. Every new pharaoh became Horus on earth, and when they died, they became Osiris. This created a peaceful cosmic cycle, the living king as Horus, the deceased king as Osiris, and the next king as Horus again. A smooth transition, almost like an eternal relay race, but with fewer congratulatory handshakes. Queens also held important spiritual roles. Isis was their model, representing motherhood, magic, and protection. Queens participated in rituals, managed estates, and sometimes ruled outright. Their crowns and jewelry often displayed symbols of goddesses, showing their connection to divine power. And now we drift toward one more layer of belief, the idea of transformation. The Egyptians thought the soul had multiple parts: the Ka, the Ba, the Ak, and more. Each had different roles. The Ka was a person's life force. The Ba carried personality. The Ak represented a transformed, eternal state. Tombs were built to support these spiritual elements. Food offerings fed the Ka. Spells painted on walls guided the Ba, and proper burial ensured the Ak could exist peacefully. Tombs weren't gloomy places. They were filled with scenes of gardens, livestock, granaries, banquets, and music. Egyptians believed that if they filled their tombs with images of pleasant things, those things would be available to them in the afterlife. It was the ancient version of packing for a very long trip. This is a good spot to pause. We've wandered through the lives of gods, priests, families, and kings, all moving at a steady pace through a world shaped by divine presence. Now let's drift into another quiet corner of the past, where the light settles softly on stone walls and the breeze carries the faint scent of old incense. Everything feels unhurried here, as if even time is taking a slow walk along the banks of the Nile. We pick up exactly where we left off, surrounded by calm rituals, thoughtful gods, and a worldview shaped gently by thousands of years of observation in this part. We'll move deeper into the inner workings of the Egyptian religious mind. Not the dramatic myths, but the quieter ideas underneath them. The ones that shaped temples, guided rituals, and helped people understand their world. The Egyptians were masters of slow evolution. Their beliefs didn't change sharply. They unfolded gradually, like lotus flowers opening at dawn. And as we go through this long, gentle journey tonight, we'll look at how the gods blended together, how their stories adapted, and how the Egyptians found comfort in the divine logic of their universe. Let's begin with something that Egyptians understood deeply: the act of becoming. They believed that gods didn't remain fixed in a single state. A god could shift forms, merge with another, gain new attributes, or represent different things depending on time and place. This wasn't confusing to them. It was natural, just as the Nile changed each season without losing its identity. The gods shifted without losing their essence. Take Ra, for example. In the morning, the Egyptians imagined him as Khepri, a scarab-faced god symbolizing rebirth. In the afternoon, he was Ra at full strength, shining with steady, controlled power. At sunset, he became Atum, the elderly, wise version of the sun. 3 forms, 1 god. If you tried to explain this to a modern person too quickly, they might get lost, but the Egyptians understood instinctively. To them, each moment of the day revealed a different side of the divine. And then there was Osiris, whose story did not stay confined to myth. Over the centuries, Osiris blended with local gods of vegetation and fertility. Statues of Osiris were sometimes planted in mud mixed with grain seeds. As the grain sprouted, it symbolized new life emerging from his body. A quiet, symbolic ritual, performed not with excitement, but with slow, attentive care. Watching grain grow doesn't sound thrilling, but the Egyptians found deep meaning in it. Life rising from the earth felt like a small miracle, even if it happened every year. Another example of divine blending is the rise of Ammon. In early history, Ammon was a local Theban god, hidden and mysterious. His name meant the concealed one, which probably helped build his reputation. As Thebes grew in power, Ammon's importance expanded until he merged with Ra, becoming Ammon-Ra. This combination created a quiet but overwhelming presence in the Egyptian imagination. A god who was both visible and invisible, radiant and hidden. Priests described him with phrases like one who made himself into millions, a very poetic way of saying, this god is pretty much everywhere. And while that idea could feel intimidating, the Egyptians seemed to find comfort in it. A universe filled with divine presence meant the world was under steady supervision. Let's drift now to another important figure, Horus. Horus was the falcon god, son of Isis and Osiris. But he wasn't just one god. There were many forms. Horus the child, Horus the elder, Horus of the two horizons, Horus of the spear, and so on. If this sounds excessive, keep in mind that Egyptians didn't mind complexity. Their world was full of layered meanings. Horus symbolized kingship, protection, and sharp vision. A falcon soaring high above the desert doesn't panic easily. It simply watches, patient and aware. That's how rulers were expected to behave minus the talons. Ideally, people wore the eye of Horus, the wedget, for protection. Sailors painted it on their boats to ensure a safe journey. Children wore it as a charm. The symbol represented healing and restoration because of the myth, where Horus's eye was wounded and then healed by Thoth. It's an elegant idea, something broken becoming stronger through restoration. The Egyptians believed healing didn't return something to its previous state, it made it more complete than before. This quiet optimism appeared everywhere in their culture. Now we move to Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming. He guided souls through the early stages of the afterlife journey. Some imagine Anubis as frightening, but the Egyptians didn't see him that way. Jackals lived on desert edges, near cemeteries, so the connection felt natural. Instead of fearing him, Egyptians believed Anubis protected graves. He watched over mummification with steady, unblinking care. Priests performing embalming rituals often wore masks of Anubis, becoming his living representatives. The process itself was slow and methodical, involving gentle washing, careful wrapping, and respectful preparation. The Egyptians didn't rush it. They believed that treating the body well helped guide the soul to peace. There was no need for urgency in eternity. Speaking of eternity, we should drift toward another powerful goddess, Mat. Mat wasn't a deity with complex mythology. She represented a principle. She embodied truth, justice, balance, and harmony. The universe functioned because of Mat. Kings ruled by Mat. Families lived by Mat. Even the gods were said to sustain themselves through her order. Priests believed that performing rituals properly maintained Mat throughout the kingdom. This gave every ceremony, no matter how repetitive, an enormous sense of calm purpose. A world full of Mat was a world that made sense now. Let's walk quietly through the temples once more. We covered their daily rituals earlier, but the structure itself carried remarkable meaning. Temples weren't simply buildings. They were miniature versions of the universe. The columns resembled bundled papyrus reeds or lotus stalks. Ceilings painted with stars represented the sky. Floors symbolized the earth. Sacred lakes outside the temple represented the primordial waters of creation. Priests used these lakes for purification rituals, dipping their hands into cool water just before dawn. The reflection of early sunlight on the lake's surface must have created a peaceful glow in the air inside. The walls were covered with inscriptions, not random decoration, but spells, hymns, and records of offerings. Everything had purpose. Even the colors had meaning. Blue for water and sky, green for life, red for power, gold for divinity. Watching sunlight reflect off gold in a dark hall must have felt like standing near something eternal. In many temples, there was also a bark shrine. A bark in this context is a ceremonial boat. The god's statue was placed upon it during festivals and carried through the streets. People gathered to watch, not with chaotic cheering, but with respectful excitement. Imagine thousands of people waiting in the shade of temple pylons, watching the slow procession of priests carrying the divine bark. The sound of sistrums, the rustle of linen robes, and the steady footsteps created a gentle rhythm. These festivals brought the gods out of the temples and into the world, reminding everyone that divine presence traveled among them. Let's move now to a topic that fascinated the Egyptians, the nature of the soul. They didn't believe in a single soul, but rather several components that worked together. We touched on this earlier, but now we'll expand it slowly, letting each concept settle in place. The ka was a person's life force. It needed nourishment even after death. That's why offerings were left at tombs. Bread, beer, meat, figs, onions, flowers, simple things that carried symbolic sustenance. The ka didn't physically eat these offerings, of course. The Egyptians understood symbolism very well. But feeding the ka maintained the connection between the living and the dead. The ba represented personality. It was often shown as a small bird with a human head. The ba could move between worlds, visiting the tomb during the night and venturing out during the day. It wasn't a ghost, more like a continuation of someone's presence. The Egyptians believed the ba needed the body to stay intact, which explains their careful preservation methods. Then came the ok, a transformed eternal form of the soul. Becoming an ok wasn't automatic. The proper rituals, spells, and moral life created this transformation. The OC existed in the afterlife as a luminous, effective being, not frightening or ghostly, just present and serene. Another part was the ren, a person's name. Egyptians believed that as long as a name was spoken, the person continued to exist in spiritual form. That's why names were carved everywhere, on tombs, walls, statues, even everyday objects. To erase someone's name was the ultimate form of punishment, a quiet way of removing them from existence. On the other hand, speaking a name kept the person alive in memory. It's a simple idea that carried enormous emotional weight. Connected to all this was the idea of the shabti. These were small figurines placed in tombs. They acted as servants in the afterlife, performing tasks on behalf of the deceased when called upon by the gods. It's essentially the ancient Egyptian equivalent of delegating chores. Shabdis were carved in calm poses, holding miniature tools. Some tombs had dozens. Some had hundreds. The Egyptians believed that if the afterlife required work, it was better to come prepared. Now let's take a calm walk through a specific myth, one that captures the slow, symbolic nature of Egyptian thinking. the journey of Ra through the underworld at night. Each evening, Ra descended into the duat, traveling through its 12 sections, one for each hour of night. The journey wasn't frightening. It was structured, almost administrative. Ra's boat glided over quiet waters. He passed through fields, caverns, gateways, and halls filled with spirits, guardians, and deities. Each hour presented a challenge, but nothing chaotic. Everything followed a predictable order. In the darkest part of night, Ra met a giant serpent representing chaos. But with the help of other gods, he overcame it. Not in a climactic battle, seemed more like a firm reminder that order would always return in the morning. And so, Ra emerged, renewed at dawn, rising into the sky once more. This nightly cycle reassured Egyptians that even the unknown had structure. Darkness wasn't something to panic over. It was simply another phase in a continual rhythm. Now let's shift gently toward another important aspect: regional variations in gods. Egypt was long and narrow, stretching along a river. Different towns had their own favorite gods. In Memphis, Ptah dominated. In Thebes, Amen. In Heliopolis, Atum and Ra. In Abydos, Osiris. Rather than competing, these gods slowly merged, borrowed traits from one another, and adapted to their regions. The Egyptians weren't concerned with rigid boundaries. They embraced overlapping stories and shifting identities. For example, the crocodile god Sobek was worshipped strongly in the Fayum region. People there respected crocodiles deeply, which is understandable if you've ever seen one up close. Sobek represented strength, fertility, and protection. In other regions, he merged with Ra, becoming Sobek. The combination made perfect sense to them even if it feels unexpected today. In another region, the Abyssidid Thoth had an entire city dedicated to learning and writing. Scribes loved him. Libraries were associated with his presence. The Egyptians believed wisdom flowed from Thoth's quiet guidance. His symbols appear on countless papyrus scrolls, artifacts, and walls. Let's drift now to magic, or Heka, another central concept. To the Egyptians, magic wasn't unnatural or forbidden. It was part of creation itself. The gods used Heka to bring the world into existence. Humans used it to maintain harmony. Priests performed Heka through rituals involving spoken words, gestures, incense, and images. Ordinary people performed magic to simple spells for protection, healing, and luck. No one saw magic as separate from religion. It was simply the practical side of interacting with the divine. One of the most famous magical texts was the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells meant to guide the deceased through the afterlife. Despite its name, it wasn't a single book. It varied from tomb to tomb. Families selected spells they thought would be helpful. Some prevented the deceased from losing their heart. Others helped them recognize gates or guardians. Some spells helped the BA navigate unfamiliar paths. Everything was practical, methodical, and strangely comforting. The Egyptians didn't leave things to chance, not even in eternity. And since we're already in this peaceful, symbolic landscape, let's end part 3 with the thought that ties it all together. The Egyptians believed that the divine world and the human world weren't separate. They touched constantly. In the rising sun, in the patterns of stars, in the long shadows of temple columns, in the steady work of farmers, in the rituals of priests, in the quiet prayers spoken by families at night. They lived in a world where gods breathed through nature, through art, through stories, and through daily habits. A world where the sacred didn't interrupt. Life it flowed through it, like the Nile itself. Let's move gently into the next stretch of this long, unhurried journey where the air grows cooler. The stone temples feel older, and the soft presence of the gods continues to linger the way early morning mist clings to the river. We begin again along the Nile, which has carried us through so many ideas already. It flows steadily beside us, unbothered, whispering its slow rhythm as we continue exploring the quieter depths of Egyptian belief. So far, we've wandered through temples, myths, rituals, and the inner structure of the soul. In this part, we drift deeper into the world of everyday spirituality, how the Egyptians learned, counted, measured, worked, healed, dreamed, and even entertained themselves through systems shaped entirely by their gods. Each idea connects to another with the same gentle logic the Egyptians applied to everything. Nothing abrupt, nothing frantic. Always steady, we begin with something that guided their entire civilization: time. To the Egyptians, time was not a straight line. It had two forms. One was Neha, the flowing, repeating time of days, seasons, and years. This was the time of Ra rising and setting, the Nile flooding and retreating, the cycle of planting and harvesting. The Egyptians saw this repetitive time as life-giving. It kept the world moving, always returning, always dependable. The second form was Jet, the still unchanging time of eternity. This was the time of Osiris, the time in which the gods existed beyond decay or renewal. It wasn't time that passed. It was time that simply remained, a still pool compared to a moving river, a pair of ideas that balanced each other as perfectly as sky and earth. To live well was to exist peacefully within both. Their entire calendar reflected this understanding. Egyptians divided the year into 3 seasons: Akit for the flood, Pere for growth, and Shemu for harvest. Each season lasted for months of 30 days, with 5 additional days at the year's end. These 5 were considered the days upon the year, and myth said that they were created so the children of Geb and Nut could be born. They were days outside ordinary time, days of transition. People treated them with a little caution, not fear, just quiet respect. Even today, anyone who has experienced humid, slow afternoons knows that some times of year just feel different. Let's drift into another aspect shaped by divine logic: numbers and measurement. The Egyptians used mathematics for everything: construction, agriculture, trade, astronomy, even magical spells. Their system was practical and steady, much like their worldview. They measured fields after the Nile flood using ropes, using geometry not as an abstract idea but as a practical tool. Temples were aligned with astronomical events, especially solstices and star risings. Priests who studied the stars, called hour watchers, stood on temple roofs at night, observing celestial patterns. Not urgently, but with patient curiosity. They believed the gods communicated through the heavens, not with sudden signs, but with consistent rhythms. One of the most important stars was Sirius, known as Sopdet. Its annual rising just before dawn predicted the coming flood. Egyptians saw this predictable event as a sign of renewal. They imagined Sopdet as a goddess leading the way for the life-bringing waters. Once again, the divine appeared not in storm or spectacle, but in consistency. Let's drift from the stars back to earth and gently examine how the Egyptians viewed health. Healing wasn't just physical. It flowed through the combined actions of doctors and priests. Medical papyri preserved remedies involving herbs, oils, honey, and bandages. Many treatments were surprisingly effective, though some might raise eyebrows today. Regardless, Egyptian healers approached illness with methodical calm. They believed the body had channels through which life flowed, and blockages caused trouble. Their understanding wasn't perfect by modern standards, but it was thoughtful. Doctors invoked Sekhmet, goddess of healing and destruction. She had the power to cure or harm, so priests trained in her rituals tried to keep her calm. You could say the entire healthcare system depended on convincing a lioness goddess to stay in a good mood. A delicate strategy, but apparently it worked often enough. Other healing deities included Sekhmet, goddess of scorpions and stings, Thoth, god of knowledge, and Imhotep, the architect, later worshipped as a healer. Temples dedicated to healing allowed people to sleep within sacred spaces, hoping for dreams that brought remedies. This practice, called incubation, treated dreams as messages from the gods. Sleep was seen as a doorway, not dramatic, but quietly significant. Doing things slowly gave the Egyptians time to observe. They noticed how wounds healed, how herbs soothed pain, how water purified, how rest restored strength. Their calm approach to medicine mirrored their calm approach to spirituality. Let's move now to the field of magic, again more specifically, practical everyday spells. These weren't dramatic curses or powerful incantations. There were small protections and reassurances sprinkled through daily life. A mother might recite a charm to keep a child safe from nightmares. A farmer might say a few words before opening a granary. Travelers carried amulets against snake bites. Craftsmen whispered spells before carving statues, believing that correct words shaped correct results. Amulets were everywhere. The Eye of Horus for protection, the scarab for renewal, the ankh for life. Tiny figures of deities worn on cords. Even simple shapes, like knots, carried symbolic meaning. People didn't think of these as superstitions. They were everyday anchors, quiet connections to the divine. Now let's drift toward architecture. Because Egyptian buildings were not just structures. They were spiritual statements. Each stone, each angle, each courtyard served purpose. We often think of pyramids as monumental tombs, but to Egyptians they represented rays of sunlight, stairs to the sky, and eternal stability. Their shapes symbolized the primeval mound that first rose from the waters of creation, a reminder of beginnings. Pyramid texts carved into stone spoke softly of rebirth, guiding kings toward the stars. These texts weren't dramatic passages. They were steady, methodical instructions, almost like a cosmic user manual written with great care. Not far from pyramids stood mastabas, the tombs of nobles. Their walls showed scenes of daily life: fishing, farming, weaving, baking. It may seem strange to decorate a tomb with so many ordinary moments, but Egyptians believed these images came alive in the next world. A painted baker endlessly kneaded dough. A painted cow endlessly gave milk. A painted musician played eternally. They were creating a peaceful, ideal version of life to continue forever. Even their afterlife was designed to feel familiar and steady. Let's walk slowly into the world of scribes now. Writing in Egypt wasn't just record-keeping. It was sacred. The act of writing invited Thoth's guidance. Scribes practiced long hours, learning hundreds of symbols. They sat cross-legged with reed pens and palettes, dipping into pots of ink, copying carefully. Their work produced temple inscriptions, legal documents, medical texts, stories, letters, and spells. Their handwriting carried the rhythm of the culture and read, deliberate and clear. Scribes sometimes wrote stories about the gods in calm, narrative style. Not dramatic epics, more like thoughtful reflections on divine behavior. One famous tale describes how humans once rebelled against Ra, who then sent Hathor in her fierce form to punish them. Yet even in that myth, the resolution comes through cleverness, not destruction. Ra softened Hathor's fury by giving her beer dyed red to resemble blood. She drank it, became pleasantly relaxed, and humanity survived. You could say the world was saved by a mild hangover, which is probably one of the least dramatic mythological endings ever recorded. Now, let's drift toward funerary practices again, but this time focusing on ordinary people rather than kings. Most Egyptians couldn't afford elaborate tombs, but they still cared deeply about burial. Even modest graves contained simple wooden coffins, amulets, pottery, and small food offerings. Families visited the deceased, bringing water and bread. They believed their ancestors helped them from the afterworld, not as ghosts haunting them, but as quiet supporters. Some families wrote letters to the dead, asking for help with disputes, illnesses, or personal struggles. These letters were placed in tombs or burned in offerings. Egyptians didn't think of death as separation. They thought of it as a shift in responsibility. The living and the dead supported each other. Let's float now toward the Great Desert, a landscape the Egyptians respected deeply. The desert represented both danger and sacredness. It housed wild animals, hidden oases, ancient burial grounds, and mysterious rock carvings. Seth was associated with the desert's energy, predictable and harsh, yet essential. Travelers crossing desert paths offered small prayers before leaving the fertile banks. Not dramatic pleas, just calm requests for shade, water, and good fortune. Now let's turn our attention to the Nile, because no Egyptian idea makes sense without it. The river shaped everything: beliefs, economy, agriculture, festivals, identity. Egyptians personified the Nile as Hapi, a gentle, round-bellied god carrying offerings of plants and food. Hapi symbolized abundance. He didn't rule the Nile with force. He simply embodied its generosity. Egyptians celebrated him with quiet gratitude. The flood was praised in hymns, describing how it filled fields, nourished fish, enriched soil, and made life possible. Even today, reading those hymns feels like stepping into calm water. As we drift further, let's explore another layer of culture: artistry. Egyptian art was not meant to capture a moment. It was meant to represent eternal truth. That's why figures appear in profile with calm expressions. The style wasn't meant to be realistic. It was meant to be timeless. Gods always maintained their symbols. Humans were shown doing useful tasks. Scenes remained orderly, even joyful, because Egyptians believed depicting harmony helped create harmony. Carvers chipped away stone with careful strikes, smoothing edges, polishing surfaces, and adding pigments mixed from minerals: blue from green from malachite, reed from ochre, white from gypsum, black from charcoal or soot. These colors were applied gently, layer by layer, producing a peaceful vibrancy. The final result looked steady and controlled, just like their worldview. Let's move on to their views on animals, which were more complex than we often realize. Egyptians didn't worship animals themselves. They worshipped the divine qualities those animals represented. A cat symbolized protection and grace. A hawk symbolized sharp sight. A ram symbolized fertility and power. A crocodile symbolized strength and resilience. These animals lived beside humans, shaping their understanding of gods. It wasn't unusual for Egyptians to talk about divine traits by observing creatures around them. They learned from nature quietly, without forcing conclusions. Now we approach another important layer: festivals and music. The Egyptians believed sound had power. Instruments like sistrums, flutes, harps, and drums created vibrations that pleased the gods. Temple musicians spent hours practicing, producing gentle rhythms. During festivals, crowds followed processions with soft chanting, not chaotic singing, more like collective humming carried by the breeze. One festival involved carrying the statue of Ammon by boat from Karnak to Luxor. Thousands of people gathered along the riverbanks, watching priests row slowly across calm waters. The boat shimmered in sunlight, decorated with gold that reflected the sky. It was a moment of unity, a moment when the divine presence felt close. Now let's drift toward the topic of wisdom literature. Egyptians wrote instructions for living a good, steady life. These texts encouraged honesty, patience, self-control, humility, and kindness. Do not speak until your words are ready, one text advises. Do not rush in stressful times, says another. These teachings reflect the same gentle philosophy we see everywhere in their culture. The Egyptians believed the world was balanced because everyone gods, humans, animals, rivers, stars played their part without trying to dominate everything else. They valued steadiness over excitement, order over unpredictability, and continuity over change. Their gods reflected this mindset. Their art reinforced it. Their rituals preserved it, and so, as we pause here, we remain in a world that moves softly, guided by cycles, shaped by symbolism, and held together by a quiet belief in harmony. Let's drift quietly into the next stretch of this long journey, where temples start to feel even more ancient. The sun sits low and warm over the desert, and the soft rhythm of Egyptian belief moves at the same steady pace. Everything here seems comfortable in its slowness. Even the gods appear content to remain in their carved niches, watching centuries pass with the patience of stone. We begin this part by returning to something that shaped the Egyptian spirit deeply: their sense of cosmic geography. The Egyptians didn't imagine the universe as a single place. Instead, they divided existence into several realms connected by pathways, gates, and rivers. Each realm had its own atmosphere, its own purposes, its own gods. And each realm existed with the same quiet structure they applied to everything else. First, there was the land of the living, the Egypt we know: fields, towns, temples, riverbanks, marshes, and deserts. This was the realm of daylight, where humans worked and worshipped, where the Nile rose faithfully, and where the sun warmed crops into life. The Egyptians called this the two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt. The division didn't cause tension for most of history. It simply reflected the idea that everything had complementary sides: south and north, valley and delta, lotus and papyrus, kings wore crowns that combined symbols from both regions, showing unity, not rivalry. Next came the land of the dead, not as a distant, frightening abyss, but as the West. Egyptians buried their dead on the western side of the Nile, where the sun set. They believed the deceased walked with the sun god as he traveled toward night. This landscape was seen as peaceful yet serious, filled with tombs, mortuary temples, and quiet pathways through cliffs. When you walk through places like the Valley of the Kings today, the silence feels intentional, almost protective. The Egyptians would have understood that silence very well. Then came the Duat, the underworld, which wasn't a world of punishment, but more of a transitional space. A place where time moved differently, where souls transformed, where Ra journeyed nightly, where Osiris presided with calm authority. The Duat was filled with strange landscapes, lakes of fire, islands of reeds, fields of plenty, caverns guarded by patient deities, and, through it all, ran a cosmic river on which Ra sailed. Every element symbolized something important, though nothing moved quickly. Even the guardians of the Duat waited quietly at their posts, performing their tasks with eternal steadiness. Above all this lay the sky, ruled by Nut, the great goddess whose star-covered body arched gently across the heavens. Egyptians imagined the stars as souls or gods traveling through her. They believed the Milky Way represented a divine river mirroring the Nile. The sky wasn't far away or unreachable. It simply existed as one more layer of divine presence, and beneath everything lay none. The primordial waters, the silent potential of creation. Egyptians didn't fear this abyss. They respected it. It represented the beginning, the source, the possibility of rebirth. Let's drift from cosmic geography into something more grounded. Death rituals in detail. The process of mummification wasn't simply an attempt to preserve a body. It was a conversation with the gods, a reassurance that the body would remain a suitable home for the soul. The process took around 70 days, slow, deliberate, full of ritual meaning. It began with purification. The body was washed with Nile water, symbolizing renewal. Then came the removal of organs. The Egyptians understood that organs decayed faster than flesh, so they removed them carefully and preserved them separately. Each organ was placed under the protection of a specific deity, known as one of the 4 sons of Horus. The liver belonged to Imseti, the lungs to Hapi, the stomach to Duamut, the intestines to Kebasit. Their images appeared on jars, each watched over by a goddess. Nothing was left unprotected. The heart was left inside the body. Egyptians saw it as the center of emotion, memory, morality, and thought. They didn't consider the brain important. In fact, they removed it through the nostrils with quiet practicality, never writing much about the process, possibly because they didn't find it particularly glamorous. Once the body was dried with nature, it was wrapped in layer after layer of linen. Between the layers, priests inserted amulets, each with a specific purpose: protection, health, transformation, rebirth. The scarab placed over the heart carried a spell asking the heart not to testify against the deceased during judgment. A small, polite request to one's own conscience. The final wrappings were painted with resins, and the face might be covered with a mask, either simple or elaborate. Wealthier families included gold, believing it represented divine flesh, but even modest burials had symbols drawn with care. After wrapping, priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, enabling the deceased to speak, breathe, and eat in the afterlife. A ceremonial tool touched the lips. Incense smoked. Words were spoken slowly. And with that, the transition began. Let's drift quietly into a topic many people overlook: the relationship between gods and kingship. Kings weren't considered gods at birth, but their role elevated them into a divine state. Upon coronation, a king became the living Horus, His birth name might be forgotten by later generations, but his Horus name remained carved on monuments. This name tied him to the falcon god and symbolized protection, rightful leadership, and clarity of vision. Kings also took a two-lady's name, linking themselves to the cobra goddess Wadjet of Lower Egypt and the vulture goddess Nekhbet of Upper Egypt. These protective deities represented sovereignty, watching over the king with calm vigilance. Then there was the golden Horus name, symbolizing eternity and triumph. And finally, the throne name, enclosed in a cartouche loop meant to protect the name for eternity. Egyptians didn't choose random titles. Every word, every symbol carried meaning. Queens held their own divine titles. They were associated with Hathor, Isis, and other goddesses of power and protection. In some periods, queens ruled outright. Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most successful rulers, blended her identity with both male and female roles. She wore the false beard of kingship, but also claimed divine lineage through Hathor and Amun. Her reign wasn't marked by war, but by building projects, trade, and steady administration, an excellent example of Egypt's quiet preference for order over spectacle. Let's move now to the priesthood, a world not of dramatic prophecy, but of routine and discipline. Priests didn't spend most of their time performing ceremonies. Much of their day involved cleaning, organizing offerings, preparing incense, arranging statues, replacing linens, and maintaining temple purity. Many priests served part-time, living regular lives outside their service periods. Their schedules rotated so that the temple always had purified attendants ready for rituals. Music played a part too. Temple musicians were mostly women, often connected to Hathor. Their job was to shake sistrums, play harps, chant hymns, and maintain spiritual harmony. Their songs weren't loud or theatrical. They were steady, repetitive, and soothing, the kind of music you might imagine, echoing down a stone hallway in soft waves. Now let's drift into mythology again. Egyptian myths weren't meant to be exciting stories. They explained natural cycles, social values, and spiritual principles. The Egyptians didn't emphasize conflict. Even when conflict appeared, it resolved into balance. One myth describes how the goddess Nut was forbidden to give birth on any day of the year. Thoth, always clever and calm, played a game of chance with the moon and won enough light to create 5 extra days. Nut then gave birth to Osiris, Isis, Seth, Nephthys, and Horus the Elder. This myth explained the extra days added to the calendar, but it also reflected the Egyptian belief that wisdom and creativity could solve cosmic problems without chaos. Another gentle myth tells of a time when Ra grew old and humanity began to ignore him. Hathor took on her fierce form to teach them a lesson, but Ra later calmed her by tricking her into drinking beer dyed red. The lesson here was not that gods punish humans, but that even powerful forces need balance and rest. A very Egyptian conclusion. Let us move slowly now into the world of dreams. Egyptians believed dreams were messages. Not all dreams were divine, but many carried meaning. Special dream books listed interpretations. A dream of eating crocodile meat might mean illness. A dream of sailing north might mean success. A dream of being embraced by a god usually meant protection. Dreams could also be influenced by rituals. Sleeping in temples dream incubation brought healing visions. People lay on mats or stone platforms, hoping the gods would speak through symbolic images. Priests interpreted these dreams with calm logic, not urgency. Let's drift into the world of magic once more, but this time focusing on protective spells. Many households kept small wands carved from hippopotamus ivory. These wands showed protective beings, serpents, griffin-like creatures, and dwarf gods like Base. Parents placed these wands around sleeping children, believing the carvings warded off harm. Some wands included inscriptions asking for the protection of mothers and infants. Their edges were worn smooth from years of use. Another protective item was the magic brick, placed in tombs. Each brick held a protective figure, a jackal, a human-shaped guardian, a flaming torch. These bricks represented guards stationed at each cardinal direction, keeping the deceased safe from harm. Now let's wander into the agricultural world again, because Egyptians lived closer to nature than most modern people. They observed changes in the Nile carefully. They knew when the first wave of floodwater arrived in El. They watched for the appearance of blue-green silt. They measured water levels with Nilomitis stone stairways carved with markers. Priests interpreted these measurements not as data points, but as messages from Hopi and Kunum. A good flood meant prosperity. Too high a flood meant damage. Too low meant famine. But whatever the river brought, Egyptians adapted calmly. Their entire society leaned into the rhythm rather than fighting it. Let's rest for a moment in the world of household rituals. Families kept ancestors' steely stone slabs with names and images of loved ones. They offered bread, water, and incense, believing ancestors helped maintain balance in the living world. Children learned these rituals early. They grew up respecting the continuum between life and death. In larger homes, kitchens included clay ovens, grinding stones, and storage jars sealed with mud stoppers. Bread and beer were prepared daily. Even these simple acts had divine associations. Bread was linked to Osiris, beer to Hathor, water to the Nile gods. Cooking wasn't merely practical. It was symbolic to Thoth. Now let's drift to entertainment, because even in a calm culture, people enjoyed themselves. They played board games like Sekhmet, believed to represent the journey through the Duat. They played with throwing sticks, danced in festivals, recited poems, and told stories. Musicians performed in taverns. Acrobats entertained at banquets. Even fishermen told humorous tales about crocodiles. Because every culture has fishermen's stories. Let us now float into the subject of foreign gods. Egyptians came into contact with Nubian, Near Eastern, Greek, and Libyan deities over time. Instead of rejecting them, Egyptians often blended these gods into their pantheon. For example, the goddess Anut from the Near East became associated with war and protection in Egypt. Baal influenced storm god worship. The goddess Astarte joined rituals connected to fertility and power. Egyptian religion absorbed new influences quietly. The way sand absorbs footprints. The Egyptians didn't see life, death, nature, society, or divinity as separate. Everything fed into everything else. The gods breathed through wind, water, grain, animals, sunlight, and ritual. People lived slowly, aware of divine presence without needing dramatic reminders. Their world was wide, symbolic, and balanced.